the point of that discussion, even on Harry's version, especially Harry's version, they debate what any future child would look like long before he'd even proposed marriage to Meghan.
And I had just gotten pregnant with Lily around that same time, so we were nesting and healing, and also I don't even know I had the bandwidth at that time to think about what the big picture dream was. There was no plan.
There was all court cases with the odd charitable function where I can in between that. I put myself.
The problem wasn't what was said, it was who said it next. When a previously unheard witness surfaced publicly, aligning their account with a timeline long argued by Tom Bower, the effect inside royal circles was immediate. This was no longer a lone author asserting sequence. It was corroboration, partial, cautious, but enough to shift tone from debate to concern. Insiders say Meghan Markle reacted with fury, not because the account was dramatic, but because it reinforced something she believed had been safely compartmentalized. Timelines are dangerous. They invite comparison. They ask who knew what and when. And once a second voice enters the record, institutions stop arguing and start counting. The shift did not come with a headline. It came with confirmation. According to media figures who track royal reporting closely, a previously unheard witness stepped forward and offered an account that aligned, in key respects, with a timeline long advanced by Tom Bower. The account was careful, limited, precise, and that restraint is what gave it weight. This was not a dramatic tell-all. The witness did not accuse. They did not editorialize. They confirmed sequence, dates, order of events, what happened before what. In institutional terms, that is the most destabilizing form of corroboration. Motives can be debated. Sequence is harder to dismiss. Royal correspondents who reviewed the account noted its narrowness. The witness spoke only to what they personally observed and declined to speculate beyond it. That choice mattered. It placed the account in the category institutions fear most: factual alignment without narrative excess. For Meghan Markle, insiders say the reaction was immediate and visceral. Fury, not disbelief. The problem was not the witness's tone or prominence, it was the convergence. A second voice, aligning with Bower's timeline, altered the conversation from interpretation to verification. The timeline itself had been controversial, not because it accused wrongdoing, but because it challenged how events had been publicly framed. Bower's argument has long focused on sequence rather than intent. The witness's account reinforced that focus. It suggested that certain steps occurred earlier than widely understood, and that subsequent explanations may have been shaped after the fact. Inside Meghan's circle, advisors reportedly recognized the danger instantly. One claim can be framed as opinion. Two aligned accounts begin to resemble a record. Records invite scrutiny not of character, but of handling. Handling leaves traces. What intensified the moment was the witness's apparent independence. This was not someone positioned as an ally of Bower or a critic of Meghan. According to those familiar with the reporting, the witness had no public profile in royal debates and no history of commentary. Their emergence appeared circumstantial rather than strategic. That perception gave the account credibility with analysts. It looked less like coordination and more like coincidence. Coincidence is unsettling because it suggests pattern rather than agenda. Meghan's fury, according to people close to her, stemmed from the sense that a narrative she believed had been contained was now reopening without her consent. The witness did not add drama. They added confirmation. That is harder to counter because it does not escalate tone, it escalates confidence. Media reaction reflected this recalibration. Editors did not rush sensational coverage. Instead, they contextualized. They asked whether the witness's account materially altered understanding of the timeline. They compared language. They checked consistency. This was analysis, not outrage. The witness's restraint also limited response options. There was no inflammatory quote to rebut, no exaggeration to correct. Any aggressive pushback risked appearing disproportionate. Silence, however, risked allowing alignment to harden. According to insiders, Meghan viewed the timing as especially damaging. The account surfaced at a moment when attention had begun to drift. Its appearance pulled focus back to chronology. Chronology is relentless. It does not respond to emotion. Advisors began reconstructing the same timeline from their side. What had been said publicly, when it had been said, how it compared to the witness's account. Even small discrepancies take on significance once corroboration enters the picture. The anger inside Meghan's camp was described as controlled but intense. Not panic, but pressure. The realization that this was no longer about managing perception, but about anticipating questions that had not yet been asked. For Bauer, the witness's emergence changed little about his position. He did not amplify. He did not claim vindication. His earlier work stood on its own. The alignment spoke without his intervention. That silence amplified the effect. When claims are reinforced without orchestration, they feel organic. Organic developments are harder to discredit. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear to everyone watching closely. The story had shifted. It was no longer about whether Bauer's timeline was provocative. It was about whether it was becoming supported. And that shift is what turned irritation into fury and curiosity into concern. Inside Buckingham Palace, the appearance of a corroborating witness did not trigger public movement. It triggered method. Institutions are not frightened by criticism. They are unsettled by alignment. When two independent accounts agree on sequence, attention shifts from motive to mechanics, and mechanics are measurable. The palace's concern was not whether the witness agreed with Tom Bauer in spirit. It was whether the witness agreed in order. Sequence determines accountability. It establishes who knew what, at which point, and whether explanations evolved alongside events or after them. That distinction is central to institutional credibility. Royal systems are designed to manage ambiguity, not chronology. Ambiguity allows discretion. Chronology demands precision. Once timelines are questioned, files are revisited, calendars are cross-checked, and language is compared across moments. This is not an admission of fault. It is risk management. According to palace observers with experience inside royal communications, the first response to timeline corroboration is internal verification, not to refute publicly, but to understand privately. Which offices were involved? Which briefings occurred? Which descriptions were used externally, and when? Even neutral discrepancies matter, once alignment becomes a topic. Silence followed because silence preserves options. A premature denial can be disproven. An early explanation can age badly if additional detail emerges. Waiting allows institutions to map exposure before committing to language. This is standard protocol when claims reference process rather than behavior. The witness's restraint heightened institutional sensitivity. Had the account been dramatic, it could have been dismissed as performative. Instead, it was narrow. Narrow claims are dangerous because they leave little room for rhetorical counterattack. They do not invite debate, they invite checking. Inside the palace, the emphasis remained on boundaries. Did the timeline implicate institutional handling or personal decision-making? That line determines whether the monarchy needs to engage at all. If the claim sits outside palace jurisdiction, engagement risks unnecessary association. If it intersects, preparation becomes essential. This is why no background briefings appeared. No trusted voices minimized the account. When the palace believes something is inconsequential, it allows quiet dismissal through intermediaries. The absence of that pattern signaled seriousness. The corroboration also altered how the claim would be treated going forward. A single author's timeline can be framed as interpretation. Two aligned accounts begin to resemble a record. Records are not argued with in public. They are evaluated internally. The palace's long memory intensified the response. Royal institutions operate with archival consciousness. They assume that today's questions can resurface years later. Preparation is therefore cumulative. Once a timeline is flagged, it remains flagged. Observers noted that King Charles III's governing style favors containment through process rather than confrontation through messaging. That instinct guided the response. No spectacle, no rebuttal, only readiness. The practical consequence was a quiet review cycle. Language discipline tightened. Upcoming engagements were scrubbed for references that could be misread later. Even tangential phrasing was reconsidered. When timelines are under scrutiny, stray comments become liabilities. For Meghan Markle, this institutional stillness felt ominous. The palace was not rushing to defend or deny. It was insulating itself. That posture suggested that the institution did not see benefit in public engagement at this stage. The difference between public calm and private alarm is subtle but critical. Alarm, in institutional terms, does not mean panic. It means preparedness. Preparedness looks like silence to outsiders. The corroboration also changed how journalists approach the story. Questions shifted from, "What does this mean?" to, "Does this align?" Alignment is a technical inquiry. It is less forgiving than interpretive debate. By the end of this phase, the claim had not expanded, but it had deepened. Depth is more consequential than breadth in institutional contexts. Broad stories fade, deep ones resurface. The palace's response reflected that understanding. Do not amplify, do not contest prematurely. Know your records, maintain discipline. Let the claim either wither or evolve without assistance. This is why timelines terrify institutions. They replace narrative with measurement. Measurement does not require belief. It requires consistency. And once consistency becomes the question, everyone starts counting. The moment corroboration entered the conversation, the temperature changed inside Meghan Markle's inner circle. What had felt like a manageable claim became an unstable variable. According to people familiar with the response, the emotion was immediate and intense, but not chaotic. It was fury sharpened by calculation. This was not anger at criticism. Meghan has weathered that before. This was anger at convergence. One account can be dismissed as interpretation. Two accounts aligning on sequence force a different kind of reckoning. They narrow the field. They compress options. They turn narrative management into timeline management. Insiders describe the first hours as compressed and disciplined. Meetings convened quickly. Phones stayed off the record. The objective was not public messaging, but internal certainty. What existed? What could be verified? What might be questioned next? When timelines are challenged, certainty becomes currency. The fury stemmed from a sense of ambush without theatrics. The witness did not grandstand. They did not accuse. They simply agreed with Tom Bower on order. That restraint left no excess to attack. There was no overreach to point to, no inflammatory rhetoric to discredit. The alignment spoke quietly and carried weight. Advisors quickly understood the bind. Any aggressive response risked elevating a story that had not yet demanded a response. Any denial risked being tested against dates and records. Any explanation risked opening new seams. Silence preserved flexibility, but intensified private pressure. The anger turned inward, toward process. According to those close to the discussions, Meghan pressed for answers about exposure rather than optics. What documents existed? Who handled them? How descriptions had evolved. Even minor shifts in wording can become focal points once corroboration appears. The sense of losing control was acute. Meghan's public strategy has often relied on context, intent, and lived experience to correct misreadings. Timeline scrutiny shifts the terrain. It prioritizes sequence over sentiment. It asks whether explanations followed events or preceded them. That question is colder and harder to soften. As the hours passed, fury gave way to urgency. The team moved from reaction to modeling. If the witness's account held, what questions would follow? If more voices emerged, how would alignment be framed? What could be said that would not require revision later? The aim was to avoid creating artifacts that could be compared unfavorably down the line. This is where Prince Harry's role became pivotal. Insiders say he urged restraint with unusual firmness. He recognized the trap of escalation. Corroboration changes stakes precisely because it invites verification. Pushing back emotionally can harden attention rather than diffuse it. Harry's counsel focused on time. Let the cycle breathe. Let journalists do their checking. Avoid feeding the alignment with additional language. His experience with media disputes had taught him that the most damaging moments often arise from responses rather than claims. That advice did not erase tension. Meghan felt exposed as time passed without engagement. Each hour of silence felt like surrender rather than strategy. The difference was experiential. Institutions experience silence as control. Individuals experience it as vulnerability. The team debated whether to contextualize the witness, not to attack credibility, but to situate perspective. The idea was tested and dropped. The witness had been careful, limited, and factual. Any attempt to contextualize risked appearing dismissive or defensive. Another option considered was proactive transparency. lay out a comprehensive account, and invite comparison. That path was rejected quickly. Transparency works when facts are settled. When alignment is emerging, transparency can multiply points of contention. Every detail becomes a new surface for scrutiny. The fury also reflected frustration with asymmetry. Buckingham Palace could afford silence. The institution was not being directly accused. It could prepare without pressure. Meghan, by contrast, carried the interpretive burden alone. That imbalance sharpened resentment. Insiders note a tightening of access as a result. Information sharing narrowed. Appearances were reassessed. Any environment that could generate new records was scrutinized. The goal was not withdrawal, but risk reduction. When timelines are under the microscope, new material becomes potential evidence. Harry worried about overcorrection. He cautioned that retreat can look like avoidance. The balance between presence and protection became a point of ongoing negotiation. Too much engagement risks amplification. Too little invites speculation. There is no stable middle when corroboration enters the frame. As days passed, the fury cooled into vigilance. Vigilance is exhausting because it offers no resolution. It requires constant readiness without action. Every new article was scanned for language. Every commentator's phrasing was weighed. The witnesses' words were parsed repeatedly for scope and limitation. The psychological toll was real. Those close to Meghan describe a heightened sensitivity to timing and phrasing. Decisions that once felt straightforward now carried downstream implications. Even neutral statements were delayed to avoid unintended alignment with contested sequence. The team also recognized a longer-term shift. Corroboration changes how future claims are received. It creates a reference point. Even unrelated stories can be reframed through it. If the timeline holds, becomes a preface that colors interpretation without asserting conclusion. This realization intensified the sense of loss of control. Narrative management depends on being able to close chapters. Corroboration keeps them ajar. The door does not swing open, but it no longer seals. Harry's presence remained steady. He supported restraint while acknowledging strain. His focus stayed on survivability rather than victory. In disputes involving process, winning is rare. Enduring without damage is the goal. The fury that began the phase had transformed into resolve by the end of it. Not resolve to confront, but resolve to adapt. Meghan's team began planning for a landscape in which timelines could resurface unpredictably. Adaptation meant fewer improvisations, clearer boundaries, and a bias toward minimalism. Critics would later frame this as control. Supporters would frame it as prudence. Inside the room, it was neither. It was necessity. Corroboration narrows margins. Narrow margins demand precision. By the close of this phase, one truth had settled in. The witness had not proven anything publicly, but they had changed the rules privately. The conversation was no longer hypothetical. It was conditional and counting. That is why fury mattered less than what followed it. Anger burns hot and brief. Vigilance burns slow and long. And in royal controversies, it is the long burn that reshapes outcomes. The most consequential shift did not happen in public view. It happened in classification. Once a second voice aligned with the sequence long argued by Tom Bower, the claim moved categories. It stopped being a contested narrative and became a reference point. Reference points do not need conclusions to exert force. They shape how everything else is read. For Meghan Markle, this reclassification changed the terrain permanently. The danger was no longer a single allegation, but a framework. Timelines invite cross-checking. Cross-checking invites archives. Archives invite patience, and patience favors institutions. Inside Buckingham Palace, the response settled into long memory mode. That does not mean paralysis. It means quiet preparation without public engagement. Royal systems are built to absorb claims and wait. They do not require immediate vindication. They require consistency over time. Corroboration, even limited, triggers that mode because it suggests durability. This is why the palace did not move to rebut or contextualize publicly. Any attempt to do so would have elevated a developing record into a dispute. Disputes demand resolution. Records demand stewardship. The institution chose stewardship. The implications for Meghan were asymmetric. Individuals live inside media cycles. Institutions live across them. When corroboration enters the picture, individuals feel urgency while institutions feel advantage. The palace could let the claim exist as context without consequence. Meghan had to live with it as a variable in every future interaction. Observers noted the subtle shift in language among commentators. Phrases like, according to Bauer, gave way to aligned accounts suggest. That shift matters. Attribution to a single source invites rebuttal. Alignment implies convergence. Convergence is harder to undo because it does not depend on persuasion. This is how corroboration becomes a record without formal adjudication. It accumulates through repetition, careful phrasing, and conditional reference. If accurate, becomes less prominent. The claim is not asserted as truth, but it is treated as plausible enough to influence interpretation. That plausibility is the leverage. For Meghan's advisors, the strategy evolved accordingly. The goal was no longer to refute the timeline. It was to prevent it from becoming the default lens through which unrelated events were interpreted. That required discipline in future messaging and restraint in engagement. Restraint, however, carries cost. Silence can read as calculation. Engagement can read as insecurity. There is no neutral posture once corroboration exists. Every choice is read through the new frame. Prince Harry understood this intuitively. His experience with institutional conflict had taught him that once a claim shifts from opinion to process, the safest course is to minimize additional material. Every new statement becomes potential evidence. Every clarification becomes a new timestamp. Harry's influence in this phase was stabilizing. He pressed for consistency and warned against reactive transparency. Transparency, when incomplete, can create more questions than it answers. In a timeline dispute, partial disclosure invites deeper excavation. The psychological impact of living under an open-ended reference point should not be underestimated. Those close to Meghan describe a recalibration of instinct. Spontaneity gave way to caution. Decisions were filtered through a new question. How will this look when placed next to the timeline? That question did not exist before corroboration. Now it does. The broader media environment amplified this effect. Digital platforms reward context stacking. Clips, quotes, and past statements are juxtaposed automatically. A timeline becomes a connective thread that algorithms can exploit without intent. The record builds itself. Critics argue that this dynamic reflects a lack of transparency. Supporters argue it reflects the cruelty of retrospective scrutiny. Both positions miss the central point. Corroboration changes incentives. It makes future risk management more conservative, because the cost of misalignment increases. The palace's alarm, described earlier, never escalated into visible action because it did not need to. Alarm in institutional terms is preparedness, not panic. Files are reviewed. Language is disciplined. Exposure is mapped. Then, time is allowed to do its work. Time is the monarchy's most reliable ally. It dulls urgency and disperses focus. For individuals, time can intensify pressure. The mismatch defines outcomes. As weeks passed, the witness's account was cited less frequently, but more confidently. That is the hallmark of record formation. Frequency declines, authority increases. The claim becomes background knowledge rather than breaking news. For Meghan, adapting to this new reality required a reframing of control. Control could no longer mean closing the story. It had to mean managing coexistence with it. That is a more difficult task because it offers no endpoint. The episode also reframed Tom Bauer's role. He did not need to escalate. His earlier work gained reinforcement without his intervention. That reinforcement insulated him from charges of obsession or agenda. When others align independently, the original author's posture becomes secondary. The witness, by remaining narrow and factual, contributed to this insulation. Overstatement would have invited rebuttal. Restraint invited checking. Checking is what institutions do best. The long-term consequence is subtle, but enduring. Future discussions that touch adjacent themes will carry the timeline implicitly. Journalists will reference it as context. Analysts will cite it as background. It will not dominate, but it will persist. For Meghan, the challenge ahead is not vindication, but navigation. Navigating a landscape where one more axis exists. Public life often involves managing multiple narratives. Corroboration adds a structural one. Structural narratives are harder to bend because they are anchored to sequence rather than sentiment. Harry's concern remains long-range. He recognizes that once records begin to align, the safest path is to avoid creating new records that could be compared. That does not mean silence forever. It means intentionality. Fewer off-the-cuff moments, clearer boundaries, a bias toward formats that limit archival sprawl. The palace will continue its watchful posture. Anything that aligns once can align again. Preparedness is cumulative. In the end, the fury that marked the beginning of this episode was less important than the adjustment that followed. Fury passes. Adjustment endures. Corroboration did not settle the timeline publicly. It made it plausible privately. That plausibility altered behavior across the board. Meghan tightened control. Harry urged restraint. The palace prepared quietly. That is how records form without verdicts. They shape decisions without announcing themselves. They influence outcomes without demanding belief. And that is why this moment mattered more than the noise around it. When two accounts align, institutions stop arguing and start remembering. Once remembered, timelines do not disappear. They wait. When one voice speaks, institutions listen. When two align, they prepare. If you want careful, grounded analysis of how witness accounts reshape power and why timelines trigger real alarm, subscribe, share your thoughts, and stay with us as we follow what happens when records begin to agree.